Good afternoon to everyone. Respected speaker of today's evening, Dr. Ranjana Tablial, retired program leader, Master of Research in Creative Practices, the Glasgow School of Art Research and Postgraduate Studies, Glasgow, Scotland. Thank you so much, Madam, for accepting our invitation and going to deliver the lecture on morality, ethics, culture, and our response in research practices. We are so glad to see you from Scotland. Had it been without Corona, we would have invited you to India to speak in our Northeast Pasigat. So due to this pandemic, we could meet through this Zoom platform. Participants mostly from students, some of the research scientists and the faculties, and some of them from all over India, and few more participants from the abroad. And thank you so much, Madam, for accepting our invitation and going to deliver this one. So I think you have, as Dr. Shivani reading out your biography, I could see that you are, you have taught about the pedagogy. All the students and even the learned faculties are there to learn from you more. So there's a pedagogy and even this morality and ethics related with the cultures and other thing. So without, I don't want to stand between participant and you. So now I'll give it to you them. Take the study now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hello? Thank you very much. I hope everyone
can share the screen.
Yeah, okay, I will share it. Right, I hope everyone can see the first slide. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this. It's an absolute honor. And I'm really very grateful to Dr. Shivani, Dr. Raja, and everyone else who's been involved in setting this up. It's such a wonderful idea. And quite a new thing for me to be addressing students, obviously through Zoom. We're all having to learn to do that. We had a few technical problems earlier. I hope they have all been sorted. It's a bit of a slight compatibility issue, which is quite in keeping with our theme, because what are ethics but about looking at compatibilities? What is research without communicating with others? So that's the kind of approach I'm taking to this whole idea: morality, ethics, culture, and our respondents. So my background is in the arts and education. Over many years, I've also led a master's program in which students from the arts and humanities and creative arts learn to combine their creative interests with formal research training. The idea was they would arrive with a research question and devise a research project as a means of answering that question. They would do this through their artistic medium alongside academic research methodologies. Now, from the outset, the projects had to work across several disciplines, not just between studio practice and academic research, but depending on their question, they had to build bridges to do comparative work across cultural studies, art and design history, various humanities, and even in some cases, sciences. We had a medical doctor, for example, who took a year out from his training to ask the question, what is a human being? He thought, I'm going to be 23, I'll be qualified as a doctor. What do I know about people except that they have organs and the organs connect with each other? It's a very profound question. Is there a problem, Shivani? Okay. We also had a geologist who already had a doctorate in science, but she wanted to transfer to the arts. So it was all about this bridge building because she felt that amongst her scientist community, there were those who often had hunches. They thought they had intuition, but somehow their training mitigated against this. Their training made them feel you cannot go by intuition. It all has to be hard fact. So she was exploring this gray area between what happens. And she even gave the example of um, people who studied volcanoes who had a sense that something was about to go wrong, but the readings were not correlating. And they would feel terribly guilty because some natural disaster would occur. And because their scientific training didn't allow them to follow a hunch, they had been damaged. So there are all kinds of ways in which these questions of moral judgment, intuition, training sometimes collide, sometimes crash, sometimes they work beautifully together. So what kind of flexibility do we need to acquire? We also had another fine example. We had a punk singer. Some of you might remember the 80s phenomenon of the punks. They still continue. They don't all have orange hair, and you know, the wild look that was very much a part of it in the 80s is not always there now. But they are people who criticize society or critique society through their music. So we had a woman punk singer, and she wanted to examine the kind of uh, consultative ways that punk music had as part of it. It would, for example, pass the mic to the audience at some point, and they would sing instead of the singer. So there was this idea of power sharing that was part of the music culture itself. She was asking the question, can I use that way of approaching the audience to do research? Because she encountered many stories of women who had been in terrible abusive situations within the punk community, outside in society. So she thought, can I use this collaborative way of sharing one's voice, of getting one's voice heard in order to look at research itself? So we had quite a range of people coming and going through these. I did notice very early on two important things in this program study. Firstly, that for many students, learning to work as objectively as possible about subjects they quite often felt very strongly about gave them a great deal of confidence and a sense of agency, that they could do something about an issue or situation, or simply understand the world understand the world a little better. This helped them to know themselves a little better too. So the idea of research as self-knowledge began to gel in my mind. Not that the research projects were about the students themselves, but that they gained a stronger sense of who they were and what their values were, and what their connection to the rest of humanity was. Secondly, it was evident that whatever the subject matter, an understanding of culture and how we understand it would be necessitated at some point or the other. In reflecting on fundamentals of research ethics, it seemed even more important to think of the idea of culture, of society, and about how we form our ethical and moral judgments. At the heart of this presentation, therefore, lies the idea of culture and all its implications. But what is culture? Why is it important? What does it tell us about our values? When it comes to research, do we recognize the presence of these cultural values in ourselves and in any group that we might be working with? In situations where the lifestyle, language, history, and belief systems are quite different from our own, how do we treat that difference? Do we see it as a hindrance? Do we see it as something to be improved or corrected, to be made into a more homogeneous relationship with the majority represented by the researcher and her situation? How do we position ourselves there? Do we see difference as a bridge to be crossed, as an opportunity to learn something about humanity and ourselves? Interestingly, the dictionary definition of culture in itself throws up many of the ambiguities that exist within the relationship of culture to research practices. So I've got you here the the Random House Dictionary definition, which will come up very early on if you go to your internet dictionary.com. These are the definitions that you'll get. So it's worth a look. As a noun, it means the quality in a person or society that arises from a concern for what is regarded as excellent in the arts, letters, manners, scholarly pursuits, etc. That which is excellent in the arts, manners, etc. A particular form or stage of civilization as that of a certain nation or period, Greek culture. Development or improvement of the mind by educating or training. The behaviors and beliefs characteristics of a particular group of people as a social, ethnic, professional, or age group, usually used in combination. The shared beliefs, behaviors, or social environment connected with a particular aspect of society. The values, typical practices, and goals of a business or other organization, especially large corporations. In anthropology, the sum total of ways of living built up by a group of human beings and transmitted from one generation to another. As a verb, to subject to culture, to cultivate. And in biology, as many of you are, I believe, science students, know all too well, in biology, it means to grow microorganisms, tissues, etc., in or on a controlled or defined medium, or to introduce living material into a cultural medium. Now, looks like a very straightforward set of definitions, but on closer examination, when you start to see the examples that are provided by the dictionary, we find in definition 3, a particular form or stage of civilization as that of a certain nation or period, and the only example given is Greek culture. While we could not expect an exhaustive list of all the cultures in the dictionary of words, the choice is striking as an explanatory example. Selected, we can assume, because the authors of the dictionary expect the readers to obtain clarity from its use. Why give it otherwise? So we look at it and we say, yes, I know what Greek culture is. I heard about it in primary school, so I know what is meant by culture. It is striking because by relying on this assumption, the authors also reinforce the idea of ancient Greek civilization, long considered the source of Western civilization, as definitive of culture itself. So what happens if we replace the word Greek with ancient Indian, Chinese, African, Islamic, First Nation American? Can we safely assume consensus on the universality of recognition of these cultures as culture? Thus, in considering the ethical dimensions of a research project, the relationship between researcher and respondents, a recognition of the many cultures at play seems paramount. So what I'm saying here is that if we only get this one example and our whole education system is veering towards certain examples, it begins to form our understanding of these things in themselves. So you have these other examples as well, other ways of using culture. And they all convey a certain understanding of, yes, how the word is used, but the society that it represents. And it can at times be problematic. So we need to be aware that when we speak of culture to those around us, when we approach a group of people and say, we want to study this, we want to see how this plant grows, we want to see how that custom is affecting how people feel, what they experience, we always need to know that we are looking through certain filters, and the people we are speaking to have their own filters. Sometimes they are permeable, sometimes they can form barriers. So an illuminating example of this kind of exchange sorry, I think I seem to have, okay, let me, this idea, I'll come to the illuminating example in a minute. This notion of culture being a set of filters, or our notions of it sometimes getting in the way of real communication, is very well expressed by the post-colonialist writer Edward Said. It's considered pretty much the founder of modern post-colonialism as a discipline. Now, he talks about the connection between culture and imperialism. So he's speaking in the sense of colonies and how cultures were imposed one on the other, or in subtle ways began to influence each other as well. But he also talks about the way the items within our cultural sphere also carry political messages that we may or may not recognize. And here's this wonderful description that he gives. Almost imperceptibly, culture is a concept that includes a refining and elevating element. Each society's reservoir of the best that has been known and thought, as Matthew Arnold put it in the 1860s. Arnold believed that culture palliates if it does not altogether neutralize the ravages of a modern, aggressive, mercantile, and brutalizing urban existence. You read Dante or Shakespeare in order to keep up with the best that has been known or thought, and also to see yourself, your people, society, and traditions in their best lights. In time, culture comes to be associated, often aggressively, with the nation or the state. This differentiates us from them, almost always with some degree of xenophobia. Now, the trouble with this idea of culture, Said continues, is that it entails not only venerating one's own culture, but also thinking of it as somehow divorced from, because transcending the everyday world. Most professional humanists, as a result, are unable to make the connection between the prolonged and sordid cruelty of such practices as slavery, colonialist and racial oppression, and imperial subjection on the one hand, and the poetry, fiction, and philosophy of the society that engages in these practices. It's a very astute observation that in the very things that we do not mention because we think, oh, we're safely doing culture, we're scientists, we're doing dealing with objective fact. We are poets and writers and artists. We're doing creative things. We're not involved. But at the end of the day, our taxes give our governments the money to do the things we may or may not agree with. So everything is very interconnected. And when we don't mention a thing in our supposedly neutral spheres of work, we can end up perpetuating a system. It's a very, very fascinating thing to think about. So in relation to research, as I was saying earlier, an illuminating example is given in this paper. In fact, Dr. Shivani is one of the authors, and Dr. Kumar Pandey also from your university, or from the Pashigat University. It's called Indigenous Peoples' Attachment to Shifting Cultivation in the Eastern Himalayas, India, a cross-sectional evidence. The study drew from 500 respondents from 50 villages across 6 states of Northeast India. It was concerned with gaining insight into why the practice of shifting agriculture, or JUM, persisted despite several incentives and support mechanisms introduced over time to encourage settled agriculture instead. And they have written, empirical analysis revealed that such attachment or bonding takes 3 forms, namely nature bonding, attachment to the natural landscape, social bonding, attachment to the local community and traditions, and economic bonding, attachment to the form of livelihood and place. In descending order of importance, the reasons were social bonding, lack of alternative livelihoods, economic bonding, and nature bonding. The study showed that SC is not merely an alternative method of farming, but a form of landscape management that has not only evolved over centuries of experimentation, but is also inseparable from the culture and the way of life of those who continue to practice SC. Even more important, contrary to the popular notion held by state officials and other agencies, SC provides a sustainable means of livelihood and food security to the indigenous people. This is from the synopsis. So in relation to what I have been saying up to this point, the approach taken in this study is notable because of the nature of the research questions posed and after setting within a social sciences framework. By analyzing the data from multiple perspectives, the study was able to provide empirical evidence for a social phenomenon. These phenomena were highly significant because they had impact on the take-up of government scientific advice, but had either eluded previous studies or had not been considered of importance. At the same time, rightly or wrongly, a purely humanities disciplinary approach might have been easier to dismiss. But with a combination of researchers from the sciences with forestry and agricultural expertise and a rigorously systematic analysis procedure, the study has shed light on issues that can in turn have bearing on future research and policy. The establishment of the fact that SC is also inseparable from the culture and the way of life of those who continue to practice it, these are the words of the authors, also sheds light on previously identified problems that had arisen from uptake and settled agriculture, of settled agriculture. Transformations in land use introduced through external interventions for the sake of ecological sustainability had also brought about non-linear changes in norms and values, social networks, power structures, and institutional arrangements or regulations in a given ecosystem. So it wasn't just about changing the system, but looking at the knock-on effects of that change. Without a person-centered approach that fully engaged with the practitioners of Jhum, solutions could themselves cause long-term social problems that in the end also lowered the take-up of transitional practices. The study also critiques the notion of place attachment, one that has a great deal of popularity in arts and humanities research as a singular concept. When seen in conjunction with the categories through which the analysis of data was done, nature bonding, social bonding, and economic bonding, a more complex web of meaning associated with place emerged, one that included the social and cultural structures that form the very basis of the community that is being addressed. Moreover, over the years, the Jhumias, and again, these are the authors, Professor Pandey et al., over the years, the Jhumias, based on their experience, informal experimentation and observations, and through trial and error, have developed alternative ways of using their biophysical resources, ways that are in harmony with their culture. And therefore, if these practices need any intervention, then outsiders must also, quote, consider the fundamental aspects that people care about, unquote. Researchers must be aware of the intangible factors, as the study deems them, such as those identified in the study, to avoid negative impact on the functions of existing social and economic linkages. Or if required change is instigated in one part of an intricate jigsaw, then there should be awareness that there will be a need to balance other areas too, and that it will require a consultation with the community to preempt any potential problems. This is a hugely significant idea that is being put across here. The type of conversations that need to take place, what Dr. Pandey et al. Describe as the fundamental aspects of what people care about, brings to mind phraseology of renowned education theorist Paulo Freire. Freire concisely characterizes top-down conventional educational methods as the banking model of education. This is a very familiar model that sees the student as a blank canvas, an empty repository into which the teacher deposits knowledge and instruction. That, of course, there is an element of that is always going to be needed. But it does not invite self-reflection on the part of the teacher or the taught, and cannot, as the banking model in the way Freire describes it, it does not invite self-reflection on the part of the teacher or the taught, and cannot accommodate any variation in learning styles. Nor is it able to transfer agency, since it relies on the student accepting wholesale the perceived wisdom of systems and persons outside of him or herself. By contrast, Freire proposes a problem-solving method that invites more collaborative solution finding. And he says, you'll see this text on the slide, whereas the banking method directly or indirectly reinforces men's fatalistic perception of their situation, the problem-posing method presents that very situation to them as a problem. As the perception which produced their fatalism gives way to perception which is able to perceive itself even as it perceives reality, and can be critically objective about that reality. So he's saying until you allow people to define their own problem, they cannot solve it. It's always going to be from outside. Freire employs Marxist language to speak of education as a strategy for liberation of the oppressed. His methods and aims, however, go beyond the material emancipation that comes of acquiring employment, potential, and status alone. He has argued instead that an innate quest for freedom in humankind necessitates a critical examination of oppression, and that a truly useful pedagogy facilitates that emergence, the emergence of such a consciousness. That consciousness of one's own oppression or one's lack of control is a first step towards analyzing and overcoming it. Such consciousness constitutes and defines meaningful education. Freire also warns, however, of a cycle of educational empowerment that effectively perpetuates inequality by replacing one rigid system with another. He was very critical of schooling systems that adhere to liberation doctrine rather than engaging with its recipients in order to get a fuller picture of people's needs and existent intelligences. He warns of wasted potential and social loss in producing graduates that are no longer able to identify with others still caught in the deprived circumstances from which they themselves had escaped. He challenges both teacher and student to resist the replacement of one set. Sorry, I've just said that already. The changing of unjust systems at their root through dialogue or learner-teacher partnership and self-vigilance is what we should be aiming for. And this is a continuous process. Understanding this, he says, is the purpose and definition of true dialogue. And true dialogue is both the means and the lasting result of what he calls conscientization or critical dialogue. So these are Freire's words. Finally, true dialogue cannot exist unless the dialoguers engage in critical thinking, thinking which discerns an indivisible solidarity between the world and the people and admits of no dichotomy between them, thinking which perceives reality as process, as transformation, rather than as static entity thinking, which does not separate itself from action, but constantly immerses itself in temporality without fear of risks involved. It's a very beautiful idea. Immerses itself in temporality, immerses itself in what is shifting and changing all the time. So while it's comforting to think I've cracked this now, I know how to teach, I know how to learn, I will just get on and do it in this way. Human beings aren't like that. Society is not like that. Things are changing all the time and needing reassessment. This also means that real change, real long-term change cannot take place without those in power also regaining a deeper sense of their own humanity, thereby enabling just action towards others. So Freire was talking, his work initially started in the slums of Brazil in the 60s. He was eventually exiled from Brazil and was able to return after many years. Because this very dynamic way of thinking posed a challenge which, because there was a rigidity about it, but he has this idea that you also need to liberate the oppressor. He says that this process of becoming aware of one's problem, trying to analyze it, trying to solve it, is a process of becoming fully human. And in this quote, he's following that by saying, because it is a distortion of becoming more fully human, sooner or later, being less human leads the oppressed to struggle against those who made them so. But in order for this struggle to have meaning, the oppressed must not, in seeking to regain their humanity, which is a way to create it, become in turn oppressors of the oppressors, but rather restorers of the humanity of both. So pretty much every revolution that we've had in history has often ended up with oppressing of the oppressors, and then the violence of that exchange gets embedded in society. So there's, again, a huge amount to think of there. I'll be introducing you to many ideas that I'm sure maybe some of you are familiar with them, but those who are not, there's a lot more to go into that you can, in your own time, have a look at and see how it relates to the work you are doing. So this is a very important principle of liberating the oppressor. All of this constitutes critical consciousness. And within those are the three headings of reflection on practice that recognizes the direct relationship of theory to practice, epistemological curiosity that emerges from the acknowledgement of mutuality between learner and teacher, and methodological rigor that risks stepping outside of one's certainties in order to allow new ideas to come forth. It is not difficult to see how Freire's theory of education is eminently translatable to research practices, and especially apt in relation to establishing the ethical dimensions and communication methods of a research project. Particularly interesting is the way in methodological rigor is defined not only by the implementation of evidenced controls and clear parameters, but also actively embraces risk. By this, he does not mean that risk should be taken with the well-being of participants and respondents. Rather, that the conceptualization of the scope and domain of research may need to extend and learn to listen carefully to conversations that may not seem instantly significant. So that's the connection for us. It is often in the momentary flashes of dialogue, of hunches that suggest connections between events and seemingly irrelevant captures of data that a broader understanding lies. That broader understanding could also preempt long-term missteps, especially in policy that emerge from research. So there are many ways in what he's saying about education, and I've tried to summarize just in that last section there how that might apply to our thinking. And I think another thing to bear in mind is that we sometimes make assumptions about hard differences between a scientific approach and an arts or humanities approach, and imagine that one is about empirical and the other is about something that is more nebulous than that. But I'm sure you have all come across many instances of scientists who made the next discovery or decided to try the next experiment because of something that was working in another way, or anthropological decisions that, or eye-opening events that occurred because somebody listened to a person in the society that they were supposedly studying and just listened to them as a person and began to understand things and see that they might have misunderstood, et cetera, et cetera. So the reality is that things cross over very much. When we're training, we tend to think, okay, this is the safe and scientific, and this is the less reliable artistic, but that's where I want to be. The reality is things work much more together than that. So now, if you will forgive me, I'm going to have to shuffle my laptop a little bit because we had a technical hitch and I am having trouble reading the text of my own slides. And I will be reading from the slides now. So if I struggle a bit, I might need to change glasses, etc. Okay, morality and ethics. Now, all of the ideas that we've been discussing have touched on concepts of morality and ethics. Many different applications of the terms sometimes seem to be used interchangeably. Many historical philosophical debates have occurred, and these have been added to by readings in psychology, anthropology, social and cultural studies. Both have to do with what is considered good. A useful way to think about the two terms is to consider the extent to which both have normative value in our lives. That is, what we consider to be right without questioning. So a normative value is something that we don't tend to notice. And this is one of the big themes in post-colonialism, is that if one culture dominates another culture, then its values begin to be presented without even saying so as the normal. This is what you do, and everybody else is deviating. So when we think of relationship between majority populations and ethnic minorities, for example, there can be an idea that this is the normal way, this is what everyone so-called does, and this is what the exceptions do. And there's something wrong with that equation. So the normative values are some things that we have to watch out for. With morality and ethics, I invite you to look these up for yourself, and you will see why I have not tried to give a definitive definition of either one or the other. More a kind of loose understanding, or a clear understanding actually, of how we use those ideas in how they apply to research practices. Philosophers love to argue. Philosophers love to split hairs and look at very minute detail. So you'll find many different in Western philosophy, in Indian and African ideas as well. There are a lot of ideas about what is good, what is moral practice, what is moral judgment, what is an ethical system, etc., etc. But for us, what do we need to know to proceed? So as I said, both have to do with what is considered good. A useful way to think about the two terms is to consider the extent to which both have a normative value in our lives, i.e. what we consider to be right without questioning. In general, there is in morality a sense of understood, established principles that we accept because they are part of the environment we live in. Ethics are to do with systems of thought that we turn to in a more self-conscious way. There are codes of ethics in every field of human endeavor, and these have changed over time. We might even find ourselves reflecting on or making a judgment on accepted moralities in relation to current ethical and/or legal systems. For example, child marriage. Once thought to be perfectly fine, and it's now illegal, though it is still practiced. So just in that one sentence, see all the judgments and questions that arise. Then there's the question of the place of women in society, home or work. For many, many years, it was considered quite natural, quite normal, quite morally just that the mother stayed home and looked after the children and the father went out to work. That has all now been questioned. And the roles of fatherhood have been changing. So we get this clash between morality and ethics, or this kind of permeability between them that needs to be negotiated, basically. And each research project must take into account all the potential risks involved and mitigate against it. So when we make an ethical challenge to ourselves, we say, I want to do this, but it might have this risk. In some cases, you're going to say, okay, that's too big a risk, I'm not going to take it. In other situations, you're going to say, how can I mitigate against it? And some of these examples will come up later. So let's look at culture, research culture, and educational institutions. Ethics in education are relational. They have to do with, for example, supervisory ethics. What should be your relationship with your supervisor? What does the supervisor need to provide for you? What do you need to provide to the supervisor? What are the lines that mustn't be crossed? All of these things have to be discussed, and that can range from having the right number of meetings to inappropriate behavior, etc. These things. So there is a code of ethics about how a supervisor is meant to behave with a student, and there is a code of ethics about how a teacher behaves with students in schools as well. And again, those have shifted and changed over the years to some extent. To a great extent, in terms of schooling, for example, the world over, smacking children because they weren't learning quickly enough or getting the answer wrong was considered quite normal. Now, that is actually illegal in most parts of the world. So, yeah, these shifting ideas. Then there's the idea of conduct between peers. You know, we are brought up, we say, don't cheat, don't do this, don't do that. But when you're working in a lab, for example, when you're working in a shared studio, there are codes of conduct. There's certain things you don't do. You don't go take over someone's desk. You know, all those things that, you know, in your student life, you'll have encountered various issues, but you can only object to them because there is an established code of conduct. You know what you're not supposed to do. Ethics in education are also, of course, to do with academic conduct. So plagiarism is one that you hear quite a lot about, and you must always bear in mind. It is an ethical judgment, and it is an ethical requirement that you always cite your sources. It's also very important that you watch out for inadvertent plagiarism, wording not sufficiently changed to your own, for example. using a source that in itself might have plagiarized. This can be another problem, but ultimately you are responsible if you use that source yourself. So there are all sorts of things you should look into very carefully about when you use sources, how you cite them, how you quote from them, and being very certain that when you're rephrasing, you're sufficiently rephrasing. So in summary, always cite your sources, and if you do not understand something, do not write about it until you do. Chances are, once you understand it fully, you will find the words for it. And that is what develops your vocabulary. That's what develops your ability to articulate. In some education systems, the memorizing of textbooks and key authors' works has been an acceptable form of passing exams. This culture of learning is no longer acceptable anywhere. It will land you in serious trouble and could completely destroy the hard work you have put into your research. So be very, very careful of that one. And if in doubt, consult your mentors and teachers. It's better to discuss it, consult your peers also. Because there are many gray areas, and if you're not certain, discuss it, share the problem, and see what that leads to. Recognizing cultural difference is another issue of ethics that arises in educational institutions. There's a tendency for educational institutions to expect conformity of learning and teaching styles, the things that Freire was talking about. And it continues into higher education. In research, for example, doctoral supervision, this can cause students to feel their areas of interest has no value. This is problematic as a matter of equality in education. But where the problem lies with a clash of cultural values, this can compound historical harm. And there is also a huge opportunity lost. And what I mean by that is beautifully described in this book of Other Thoughts, Non-Traditional Ways to the Doctorate, a guidebook for candidates and supervisors. It gives many examples of unusual research projects that came into being because supervisors decided to learn more about the cultural views and methods of traditional societies and their students. Who came from New Zealand and Australia. There was a recognition that beyond the research methods and structures that doctoral candidates were being asked to emulate, there were indigenous ways of communicating and sharing that were more meaningful to the candidates and to the communities they were wanting to work with. So rather than expecting the student to translate themselves, translate their methods, translate the way they deal with their own communities, some supervisors had the wisdom to say, I need to go and find out about this. And out of it came some quite remarkable work. Chapter 15, for example, describes is written by Laura Brearley and Trina Ham, spaces between indigenous and non-indigenous knowledge systems. It's written by a Yorta woman and her supervisor, and each from their perspective of the doctoral process. It describes the works and works with deep listening, which there are at least 2 words for this concept of deep listening in Aboriginal languages. The paper also shows how this approach enabled a new model of culturally inclusive research practice that could be used by others. So I wouldn't do it justice to speak in greater detail about this paper or the others, but this is a book that is very well worth looking at because it really opens one's eyes to not only cultural difference in the sense of indigenous and majority culture, if you like, or settler culture, but also about the cultures of educational disciplines and the cultures of educational institutions and how they can be enriched by reaching out and finding out what else there is that's been forgotten in the whole process of streamlining and setting into ways of university teaching. Within India too, awareness of this kind is needed. Huma Parveen and A.M. Shokat acknowledge this in their very useful and concise paper on research ethics. They say, mostly matters of research ethics differ from method to method. Most importantly, ethics also vary from place to place. In most cases, cultures in India vary from state to state and even from city to city. So researchers should have in-depth knowledge of cultures and other things of the place they are working in. And I'm sure you can all think of examples of walking into a situation where you thought something was going on, but actually when you speak to the people who are more involved in the situation, you completely were misreading the whole thing. And you can imagine how impactful that would be if you're actually making judgments or deciding on what is how to work with the community, how to improve something that, and the community might well be asking for that change. But how do you make sure that you've got the bigger picture? You need to think from a cultural perspective. So when you have that kind of conversation, you often get up with more data that you know what to do with. So this is a quote from Patricia Levy, also another very interesting author on research practices. And she says, in my own research on collective memory and national identity, I often felt that the scraps of data left strewn across my office floor were part of the heart of my work, and even more so, the heart of my relationship with my work. So how do we accommodate this? In a short factual research report, it is quite difficult to fit in the more elusive insights we have gained by talking to people, listening to their points of view. In a longer work, such as a doctoral research project, there may be space to discuss these in relation to other headline sections of the data. In both types of research presentation, the short report or the longer PhD text, the inclusion of insights gained from longer interviews and durational contact with the respondents must be planned for in the very conceptualization of the research project. It needs to be there from the outset. So let's think about that a little bit. What are the key sections of research structure? There's the research question. There are methods for answering the question. There's data gathering, there's data analysis, there are conclusions to be drawn, and dissemination of findings. The data and conclusions drawn from it must be verifiable. So we have the principle of validation, which I'm sure you've already become very aware of. Validation comes from a clear explanation and explication and documentation of the general methods of collecting data and its analysis. So it isn't enough to say, well, we did this and we came to this conclusion. We need to be able to follow step by step. And there's that principle that it needs to be repeatable, so it's valid, because someone else doing it would come to roughly or exactly the same conclusions. Ethical considerations apply at all stages. This is something very important to remember. In posing the question, in deciding one's methods, in deciding one's ways of gathering data, in critically being aware of one's own position in analysis of the data, not overly relying on the idea that one is objective per se, because we can all slip up. Even in the dissemination of findings, where does it all go? The practical aspects of your ethical framework may well be shaped by your chosen research paradigm. This is a very significant thing to think about as well. There's an overall philosophical thrust to what you're doing, whatever the discipline you're working in, and that is going to affect the practical decisions that you make. So what is a research paradigm? Mackenzie and Knipe argue that universities and research textbooks often overlook the significance of the research paradigm or offer conflicting definitions and examples. They say the theoretical framework, as distinct from theory, is sometimes referred to as the paradigm and influences the way knowledge is studied and interpreted. It is the choice of paradigm that sets down the intent, motivation, and expectations for research. Without nominating a paradigm as the first step, there is no basis for subsequent choices regarding methodology, methods, literature, or research design. I hope you can read that. It's really very small. So here are just some very frequently used research paradigms. There's the positivist and the post-positivist. This is normally described as a scientific or scientific in approach. It's concerned with empirical evidence, belief in innate objectivity of the researcher, or in structures for ensuring objectivity in analysis. Large sweeps of data and statistical analysis. So that bit is quite important that yes, you might say, well, I know I can't be objective, so I've put in mechanisms. I have a control experiment going on, or I've also consulted other people, or I've consulted a large pool of people, etc. So that I can see that there's more evidence to draw from. But even that, those can be problematic. So the post-positive paradigm factors in the potential pitfalls of positivist methods and factors in context of various kinds. Then we have the constructivist or interpretist approach or paradigm. It begins with the premise that groups of people construct knowledge, and a society or sociological phenomenon will be best understood when seen through the eyes of its members. So the researcher obtains a fuller picture when participants take part in a less passive way. Participants generate categories of knowledge along with the researcher, and these can then be analyzed by the researcher in order to shed new light on the situation. The transformative paradigm is concerned with social justice in general. It works from the perspective of marginalized groups in society affected by inequality, for example, based on race, ethnicity, caste, class, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, mental health. The aim is to bring about empowering change, transformation of the participants' lives. The transformative paradigm takes into account external political and economic causes in inequality. This can help to inform policy in a manner that is informed by those who will be affected by it. So it's not sitting in one's office redesigning however good one's intentions might be. If we don't actually actively work with those who are going to be most affected by our ideas, they will be less likely, excuse me, to be um, less likely to be effective even in the long run, but we might also miss points and we might actually misunderstand and cause problems. So it's a very much, it's shifting the emphasis of power in a sense, or shifting the agency, sharing it much more with those who will be most affected. Then there is also the pragmatist paradigm. This recognizes that all paradigms have some limitations and potential flaws. It applies methods that are most appropriate to a particular problem being studied, and it combines several methods and drawing from several paradigms if necessary. It avoids the various debates, the academic debates about where truth lies, and seeks specific targeted sets of information. So you might be doing a large study about an educational situation, or the effect of a recent change in the law, for example, and you might need to speak to people on a very individual basis. You might also need to get overall results in changes in incarceration, for example. So you would combine these things in the most practical way possible, and you wouldn't be losing your time thinking, well, is this truth, or is this subjective, or is this objective? You would just get on with it. It's that kind of paradigm of very intelligently drawing different things together. They're all very, very valid, all of these paradigms. When you get the PowerPoint, I'll leave you to look at this yourselves. This is taken from Mackenzie and Knipe. You can also read this paper online. And hopefully the book might be in your libraries as well. But it gives some of the methods and data collection tools that tend to align with these different paradigms. There's no absolute hard and fast rule, but this is the general logic of these paradigms would indicate that one works in these sorts of ways. So all of these paradigms are associated with particular means of gathering, analyzing, and presenting research, but this is not definitive or compulsory. As a researcher, you select the methods and techniques you need to understand your research question and to answer it in a convincing way. You need to gather data, present an analysis of it, and reach conclusions based on your findings. You can select quantitative or qualitative methods of data gathering or a mixed method approach. Quantitative and qualitative methods are not oppositional or mutually exclusive. I must say, everything that I'm going to say, depending on which research method book you pick up, you will find contradictions. So that just should remind you that you need to make these decisions for yourself. You need to design your research within its own logic and within its own ethos and see what works best for answering the research question and the context within which you are working. So quantitative and qualitative are not oppositional or mutually exclusive. Both are valid approaches, but each has a bearing on how data are collected and analyzed and the types of generalizations and representations derived from the data. But on the whole, social scientists have come to abandon the spurious choice between qualitative and quantitative data. You will still find articles being published where a lot of ink is being spilled on how you can't rely on one source, you have to rely on the other. On the whole, though, people have the spurious choice as a hard choice has been moved away from. To finish this quote, they are concerned rather with that combination of both that makes use of the most valuable features of each. The problem becomes one of at which point the researcher should adopt the one and at which point the other approach. Quantitative research methods tend to use large survey groups, and data derived from these to code, analyze, and present findings in the form of statistics, charts, numerical analysis, and experimentally proven hypotheses. It originated within disciplines of the natural sciences, and it also long favored in the social sciences. This assumption has been challenged by 20th and 21st century critical theory. And there's that question of culture again. Because the question arises, does the potential problem lie with the method of collecting data or the interpretation of the data? Qualitative methods tend to lend themselves to more ability for interpretation. It grew from the challenges, qualitative research methods grew from challenges to the assumption that a scientific approach would necessarily be objective, and it would therefore produce a reliable truth in a given research project. It's frequently used in arts and arts-based research. It tends to employ observation, small-scale focus groups, one-to-one interviews, questionnaires. And it frequently strays into participant research modes, the kind of transformative and interpretive constructivist ideas we were speaking of earlier. But what ethical considerations arise with this? Are they different from the ethical considerations associated with quantitative approach? And one example you can think about is that when research was considered to be only valid when it was using quantitative methods, and it was very much empirical evidence-based, it was relying on large groups of people to be surveyed, etc. Feminists, for example, started pointing out, you're trying to find out how this situation or this change or whatever it is you're studying in this society has affected the population. But your surveys are being sent out through offices, or they're being sent out through newspapers. And on the whole, the women who are not in employment are not getting access to these surveys. So your information is flawed. If you want to start looking at the whole picture, seeing how the whole of that society works, you might need to go, and this is where in a situation when most women are not in employment, feminists started saying, well, you need to send people out to the suburbs. You need to send people out to the food shopping stores, so where people are going about their daily business. You're not really, it's not objective enough simply to say, well, I had 1,000 participants. Who were those 1,000 participants? So then you start getting into the categories. And do you look at the data by gender, et cetera, and then how do you get some more detail? There can be other questions that arise if you're questioning, it might be a sensitive issue. If you're discussing with an entire family or with an entire village group, is everyone feeling free to say what they want to say? Or do you need to provide some more security to get a genuine sense of how each individual group within the group is being affected by a given situation? So there are pros and cons to both approaches. So back to this idea of validation. Resistance to qualitative methods tends to center on concerns about validation of data and conclusions. There is a reassurance of large numbers of respondents and verifiable through mathematical, statistical census processes. It's less likely to represent views of a small non-representational group. One could argue that this is also fundamentally an ethical issue. Then why bother with time-consuming, potentially subjective qualitative methods? So you've got your problems with your quantitative, you've got your problems with your qualitative. But why bother with the qualitative at all? Because it is the very subjectivity of the viewpoints gathered that provide a fuller and deeper picture. The data gathered can assume unwieldy and overwhelming proportions, so the design of interview questions and data gathering exercises is vital. So we'll do a little exercise with the designing questions in a second, but before that, let's just establish some basic ethical considerations, basic principles and best practice. First of all, there's a very simple rule. Imagine yourself in the shoes of the respondent. How would you like to be treated? What reassurances would you like to have? Observe yourself and the expectations you are placing on the respondents. Would you like to be asked to do what you are asking them to do? If not, adjust your plan. You are hoping for honesty, openness, sincerity, cooperation, so you need to offer it too. Cardinal rules. This is the blue box. Memorize this. Written permission must be obtained from all respondents for use of their words, images, and opinions. At the point of taking permission or earlier, the following must be made clear to all participants. The aim of the research and how you will use the data that is being gathered. The length of time the data will be stored and how it will be kept safe and confidential. Respondents must be offered anonymity, and this must be rigorously maintained. Respondents must be offered the option to withdraw their responses from inclusion in the research at any point. Especially with sensitive topics or when working with vulnerable people, some research paradigms include showing your initial analysis of the data to the respondents for concurrence. Permission must be reobtained prior to publication in the public domain. These things, they're non-negotiable. This is very established now as any form of research must deal with all of this. The one thing I would say is it depends. If you're doing a transformative paradigm or a more partnership, collaborative type of research project, the other big ethical question that comes up is your respondents can, in a sense, become co-authors. So you might need to renegotiate where you place them. I had this experience myself in the research project, which I'll speak about later, in which my student respondent team became very much partners in that they began to try out the methods that I was developing, and it was really in bringing so much to my thinking. It became much more of a partnership. So rather than calling them respondents, they became the student research team. They had to remain anonymous for reasons, again, I'll explain, but it opens the way for later on actually working with some of them by name and say, this joint research goes back to such and such time. So there are gray areas, but on the whole, in most situations that I would imagine most of you will be in, offering anonymity to the respondents is hugely important and maintaining it rigorously. Why be so careful? The safety, dignity, and well-being of your respondents in relation to your research project is your responsibility. Real harm can be brought about through sloppy research practices. You might disrupt power relationships within a community you're working with, causing danger or mental anguish to vulnerable respondents. Respondents may have shared information under the promise of anonymity, but be embarrassed by it if your data is not securely stored or you have not sufficiently coded the analysis. Impact of dissemination. Where do the project images or text go? Where might they be seen and where information might travel? All of these are important to think about from the outside, and you keep negotiating this. You might need to rediscuss it. I do remember another project in which a student of mine was working with women, and it was about sexual harassment. And she worked, because she cared very much about this issue, she worked with survivors of terrible experiences of two different groups. And it was a creative project. So she worked with them, and they wrote creative work together as a way of working their way through what kind of changes they would like to see in society, etc. But because this was a creative masters, there used to be an exhibition at the end of it. So the work that was produced, they had decided to name the authors of some of the poems, but the group, she thought she had better consult with them, because one of the groups had some real issues with the other group. So there was another set of little negotiations that went on about, are we naming you after all, or are we not naming you, or would you rather remain anonymous? So it was an interesting kind of situation. It does arise from time to time. So basically, on the whole, all of this is a moving process. You settle it once in the very beginning, and you need to revisit your ethical decisions as you go along, up to the point of dissemination even. So in medical research, medical researchers, of course, must adhere to many other health and safety and ethical guidelines over and above the ones we're discussing today. Drug trials, treatment trials, etc., carry huge responsibility and should be conducted in line with appropriate institutional structure. So I'm not going to speak about that. I'm not a medical professional or a teacher in that sphere, but everything I'm saying, obviously, when it goes to something as directly interventionist, if you like, as medical research, then there is a whole other area that must be strictly adhered to and considered. In all this equation, there's someone else you must not forget, someone else you need to take care of, and that is yourself. You need to consider the appropriateness of methods and data collection in relation to yourself. Safety. Where will you conduct interviews? Working in pairs is advisable. I often used to say to my students, when you set up an interview, it's very important to consider, just like meeting anyone else you don't know, where are you going to meet them? Probably best not to go meet somebody in a dark alleyway for an interview. You don't want to mistrust the entire world, but you need to be sensible about how you set things up. Awareness of vulnerable groups amongst peers, as well as participants in shared spaces. And this happens in arts and humanities researches in particular. Even in the discussion of some topics, have you considered how your subject matter might impact on you? I've often come across students who want to deal with an issue that is very important to them, but I have to say to them, you're going to be thinking about this for the next 6 months or the next year. Are you feeling strong enough to do this? How can we set in place systems that return you to a distance view from it, so that you're not constantly crushed under these things? Because let's face it, research is about the things we care about. To varying degrees, it affects us, so we need to be aware of that. There is a potential for a need to revisit the permissions given. Bear this in mind when constructing your timeline. And so you need to remember that you're so busy thinking about everyone else, you might be setting yourself back and finding that you're going to miss your submission deadline because you're being so accommodating. So there needs to be some kind of sensible balancing out of all that, thinking ahead. And that's part of taking care of yourself, because I'm sure you know the horrible feeling of a deadline approaching and not feeling quite in control. So you need to think about all these things. Are there institutional and ethical guidelines which you must adhere to? Your university or department may have a set of guidelines and should really have one, but it may not be as obvious to you where it is. And so you need to find out. Make sure you do so, and make sure you study this guidance and keep reflecting on how it applies as the research progresses through different stages. Now, the detail of the matter. Different types of questions. And where's the question of ethics going along with that? What is the most important part of conducting an interview? What do you have to ask yourself before you even locate or approach an interviewee? What is the relationship of your research question to the questions that you put to your respondents? That's the one that easily gets lost, because it's quite interesting talking to people. and getting their views on things, or even just straight yes and no answers. You can get carried away with it. But when you're designing the questions, you have to be thinking, how does it relate to my overall research question? And what is the relationship of your chosen methodology to the questions that you put to your respondents? We've said the research paradigm affects how you design the whole thing. The research paradigm also shapes the nature of the questions and the type of information that you're trying to draw. The relationship of interviewee questions to the overall research question should be considered throughout. Open-ended questions can be very useful as long as a clear method is in place for recorded variance and similarity. This paves the way for grouping and coding the data during analysis. So if you've got it all sitting in one big collection, it's really overwhelming to deal with qualitative data. But from the outset, if you're saying, okay, this is where I'm going to put this set of questions and this aspect of the question, and this is where I'm going to put the responses from that group, and this is where I'm going to put in, and when I'm saying put, it could be in the case of how you organize your documents or how you title them. That's very important, so that you can quickly find, oh, there was that group of ideas, there was that group of ideas. Very practical consideration. Now a little exercise. Look at these two questions. Let's talk about cake, why don't we? So if I ask you, what is your favorite type of cake? If you've got a piece of paper handy, jot down a few answers. What is your favorite type of cake? So if you've got a few answers written down to that, now let's move to the next question. Why do you like that type of cake? Now, when you get to the why you like that type of cake, try and be quite broad in your thinking of it. Is it because it's the type of cake that someone you like made for you? Is it because those flavors are pleasurable to you? You like those flavors? What is there beyond that? What are the associations? So you'll find that in the what is your favorite type, you might have come up with the flavor, the shape, the size. Does it have eggs? Does it not have eggs? Next one, why do you like that type of cake? Things begin to interconnect a little bit as well, because you might say, well, I like the one without eggs because I'm vegan. I like that one because it reminds me of my 6th birthday when I was very happy. Or I don't like that one because it reminds me of a very unhappy day when, even though we had cake, something unpleasant happened. So these kinds of emotional responses that are evoked tend to sit in the why questions. And when we're talking to other people, without being intrusive, the shaping of your question is going to invite certain types of responses. So this is something you can think back to as well. You know, what is your favorite type of cake and why do you like that type of cake? Think about it later on and think about what types of information emerge from each of these questions. And then you could decide to design the next 3 questions that could follow each of the first questions. So the interview continues to invite and generate the type of information required. What other factors would influence the questions and the sequencing of the questions? So there is this idea of the semi-structured interview, that in some cases interviews, the questions are set, everyone gets asked exactly the same thing and nothing left of it and nothing right of it. The semi-structured interview will allow space to say, oh, this person has said something very interesting. I'm going to add a sub-question that still relates to the overall question and builds that in to the conversation that's taking place. One thing I would advise with qualitative research is, if you're doing these kinds of open-ended interviews, limit the time, because you can go on for hours and hours and it becomes almost impossible to find the things that are important in it. Usually within half an hour, you will get enough nuggets to be able to guide you maybe to the next interview or to relate it back to the research question in a significant enough way. About half an hour, of one-to-one conversation is really quite a large chunk of time, and you would be amazed at how much you learn and how much light it sheds on whatever it is that you're looking at. Now there's the question of what other kinds of data are there besides responses to interviews. Now this is something that you can be looking at, especially when you're thinking about the book I spoke about, Of Other Thoughts. We are so set in our ways of thinking that, you know, we go out with our pencil and our pad and our board to lean on, and we write all these things down. And we listen to people. And yes, deep listening, that's very important. But can deep listening take place in another kind of format? What about if you sit and draw, or you invite your respondents to draw their ideas or some response, or say something, draw something that shows them what is significant in the lives that they wish to preserve or the lives that they wish to change. You can be recording as you walk with people. Walking is a very important, oft-used tool in emancipatory research projects. Taking photographs and inviting the respondents to take photographs. This is another thing that's happened a lot in sociology methodology. Visual and oral data. So you've got the images that you're taking, but the recordings, but there might be other things. You might burst into song. You might share some kind of response to something that's on the radio. All of these things can invite people to communicate, and that's what it's all about. There can be creative responses of all sorts and collaborations. So imaginative data gathering methods can elicit much richer responses from participants. And managing this kind of data can be complicated. What structures can you put in place? And we've spoken about some of those. So it's stored in an organized and useful way from the start. Then when it comes to analysis, you think, what do I do with the responses I've gathered? In what kind of methodology or general situation might you need to show your initial analysis to the respondents and interviewees? So we've had a few examples of that kind of thing. In emancipatory and transformative paradigms, you definitely would be wanting to do that because you're supposedly working with them and you're trying to take their voice forward. You're not taking over their voice, you're bringing it to the fore. So if your analysis misses something out, it could undo all the good that's been built up there and the trust that's been built up. So showing and it will feel irksome as a researcher because you've got your deadline, you've got your, it's beginning to look good, it's all beginning to make sense. And then the respondent says, actually, that's not exactly what I meant. It's problematic, it's difficult, but that's all part of research in which human beings are involved. So the dissemination of the research is another aspect. Have you thought about the afterlife of your research project? Conferences, seminars, poster exhibitions, events, you should think about all of these things. Ongoing public projects, building on community created through the project, or continuation of involvement with groups entered through its processes. Yeah, these are all things that take yourself seriously. It's not just for getting the degree, it's you're actually contributing something to human knowledge. Now, when it comes to descriptive and interpretive approaches to qualitative research, which Elliot and Timulak have provided a very useful, there's many writings, but there's one particular article that I'm quoting from here. Descriptive and interpretive approaches move away from that scientific observational or a fixed idea of scientific research where there is the hard fact. It tries to go in between and find something more fully meaningful that gives a clearer picture of what is going on in a given phenomenon, as we say in phenomenological research. So these sorts of methods focus on what are today regarded as established, well-used methods within the descriptive interpretive branch of qualitative research. They're methods that came into their own in the 1970s and 80s. They have become mainstream in education, nursing, and increasingly in psychology. They're especially popular in non-traditional or professional training schools. Today, because there is an extensive history with these methods, standards of good research practice have emerged. So descriptive, deductive, and inductive phenomenological research methods are very useful armatures for designing a way to make sense of qualitative data. Phenomenology itself is an early 20th century development in philosophy, and there are two key threads that led to the research methods that we know today. One stems from Husserl's ideas and the other from Heidegger. Descriptive deductive methods stem from Husserl's descriptive of phenomenology, and it asks, what do we know? What they ask, what do we know as persons? The experience of perception, thought, memory, imagination, and emotion involve intentionality, one's directed awareness or consciousness of an object or an awareness. Therefore, in descriptive phenomenology, everyday conscious experiences were described while preconceived opinions were set aside. Husserl proposed that preconceived notions about a phenomenon had to be bracketed, set aside in order for it to truly manifest. In data analysis methods stemming from Husserl's descriptive phenomenological proposal, data is gathered through often unstructured interviews, open questions, transcribed, studied for patterns and themes, results returned to the participants who confirm whether the findings match their own descriptions of their experiences or not. Inductive methods stem from Heidegger's turning the direction of Husserl's phenomenology from its epistemological focus to an ontological one. So rather than thinking about the way knowledge is formed and the structures that are creating that knowledge, it talks about being. It talks about what is the experience of the individual in any given situation. What is being. So the inductive method, or Heidegger's phenomenology, extended hermeneutics, or the philosophy of interpretations, to develop interpretive phenomenology. It broadened hermeneutics by studying the concept of being in the world rather than knowing the world. It's particularly important that hermeneutics moves beyond the description or core concepts of the experience and seeks meanings that are embedded in everyday occurrences. It is interested in interpreting and describing human experience, and since hermeneutics presumed prior understanding, bracketing was not warranted. This is a very key difference. So both are phenomenological and both are using hermeneutics in different ways, but in Husserl's train of thought, the deductive method, it assumes that it is possible to set aside or bracket the researcher's own opinions. Whereas the inductive method says that's not possible. You have to factor them in the first place. You have to see that it is part of the entire picture that's taking place. Interpretive phenomenology therefore rejects the possibility of bracketing of the researcher's understanding of a phenomenon, but includes it in the interpretation of the data. So there's a more self-conscious idea. And although I'm saying on the whole phenomenological methods move away from the positivist, that aspect of phenomenological method is very much questioned, that how can you bracket, how is that possible? You actually the factoring is the more sensible. So again, you can spend hours, days, months looking at phenomenology itself and all the different arguments within phenomenological research. But if we are looking at the practical application, this paper is a very useful one, Elliott and Timulak, and the title given in the sources at the end, and in the previous slide. They outline this very useful 6 steps in analyzing qualitative data. First, they say there's the preparation of data, the verbatim interviews, etc. Then delineating and processing meaning units. Meaning units are the units with which we do the analysis. These quotes or key observations should be traceable via coding to their sources. That is the full interview transcripts, questionnaires, etc. So we shouldn't lose the connection between them in case we want to go back to the original transcripts. Shortening, by getting rid of redundancies that do not change the meanings contained in them. While preserving the voice and language of the interviewees, sentences are simplified so that their contents are clearer. 4, organizing the meaning units into processes or phrases referred to as domains. Domains provide a conceptual framework for the data. 5, generation of categories, which evolved from the meanings in the meaning unit. So you've got your units and then you're beginning to see categories within them. 6, abstracting the main findings. And number 6 is very key. This step consists of presenting findings in a communicative way to the reader, including the use of graphics and tables. The processes of creating meaning units, domains, and categories usually ends with a taxonomy that describes and interprets the whole phenomenon as it was contained in the gathered data, within the logic of the data that you've got there. So you're not making a grand forever statement, but within the logic of this data, these are categories and steps we find and how it relates back to the research question. That is, classifications are defined and these describe the whole phenomenon as it has emerged from the data. So now I'm going to show you a little example. Shivani, can I just check, am I grossly over time? Shivani?
Yes.
Is there an, how much time have I got still?
How much time you need actually?
5 minutes.
10 minutes?
That's okay. I can do this thing, yeah. So,
Okay, fine.
I'm going to just show you how I applied, and I won't read everything in the slides, but I'll skip through this. But this was in my own research project, which came out in book form in 2018, but it's been very useful for me to explain to others. So I've included it here. So if I take the 6 steps that Timulak speaks about, there's the preparation of data. So I recorded interviews with students and I transcribed them. Identifying meaning units, significant quotes which shed light on the students' experience of art school education and the Yoruba Vedanta course, which the whole research was hinged on, and of their understanding of themselves as beings were extracted from the transcripts and questionnaires. So I wanted to know, how does the student's sense of self, this metaphysical self, how can we nurture it? Does it exist? How does it relate to the whole pedagogic experience? And this had come about because in teaching this course, which was just introducing ideas from West African philosophy and Vedantic Hindu ideas, seen through the artworks of both these geographical areas, of the geographical origins of these ideas, seen through the artworks, what was happening in the students? Why did they suddenly become so interested in a kind of philosophical outlook? What was speaking there, and then how was it impacting on their whole experience as art students? So when in the interviews, I started looking at what are the significant points that seem to shed light on these questions. The quotes were searched for indicators of the students' perception and critique of the educational environment, because that was the other big part of it, is we were trying to construct a pedagogy out of all of these ideas. How they responded to challenges, and these were rephrased as synopses of the quotes, leaving in only the most significant parts in relation to the meaning of the whole. So from the transcript, I went to reducing them with those categories in mind. Number 4, organizing the meaning units as domains. The shortened meaning units were separated out into themes emerging. On the first collation of potential themes, 92 were identified. I've reduced these to 45 and then 9. The final 9 themes were selected in 2 ways. Statistically, by picking up on topics mentioned by 4 or more of the student team, and then through a funneling process. Funneling is a good word to remember. A funneling process by grouping similar, overlapping, or conceptually connected themes into representative domain names. The Yoruba Vedanta course itself was listed as a domain in itself. So these were the 9 categories that I came out with. The 10 domains and the meaning units they contain were then critically studied for their values in relation to the research question and the theoretical sources of the thesis, namely Yoruba, Vedantic, and educational theories of Freire and Ronald Barnett. The process revealed 3 key categories that act as bridges to the thesis, leading in turn to a conceptual framework for the pedagogy proposed. This was an enormous relief, I have to say, because you know what I'm saying about these large swathes of data, but a fascinating process. So out of what they had said and out of a simplification and carefully critical evaluation of what was the key things they were saying, I came down to these 3 factors that related to the overall research question. They were to do with peer learning, resilience, and pedagogic principles valued by the students. They articulated in a by the way sort of way, conversational way, things, oh, that lecturer does this and it really helps, and that one does this, and oh, that project was really confusing. This kind of thing was, what was it? Why was it? This was a very useful way to bring down to these 3. Somewhat unexpectedly, the role of peer learning and a strong sense of identity with a community of learners came across in each of the initial interviews. And this linked to the Yoruba and Vedantic ideas of the self and the social, and to Freire's idea of becoming fully human. There were abundant examples of the students' own tenacity and resilience in trying circumstances. And this links to their will to learn, as Barnett describes it. So my theory and my pedagogic emergent theory all began to come together. And then they talk about the way in which the course was delivered, and they spoke about just a manner of the way that you were with us. So that became this kind of more nebulous thing. How do you capture that? What is it the students are picking up on there? And this links to the Yoruba and Vedantic idea of the role of the teacher or leader, progressive education theory that proposes reflective and reflexive education practices, Freire's conscientization, and Barnett's call to nurture the student's will to learn. And all three are treated in the analysis as indicators of the emergent student being and her efforts to know herself. So then it completely linked back to the research question from this large body of thoughts written down. And in brief, what this is saying here is that the methodologic process and outline of the methods and how they were related back to the aims of the themes can be listed in this way. And the findings from this one particular group of students, contextualized by the theoretical sources and guiding framework of the thesis, were considered in relation to pedagogic principles that arose and could be taken forward as a transferable education theory. So something very detailed and specific found a way to be expressed as a shareable theory. Oh, this is really unfortunate. This has got in the sharing mode, it's got separated out, but you can just about make out what I've done here is this list is given as a diagram. Much nicer to look at, but the key thing that is happening here is that I begin to see that there's a circular process. So it tells me that there is in pedagogic processes, in learner-teacher processes, and in pedagogic theory formation, a circular process is a very good way to think about it. And it's just also another example. It's unfortunate. This is the problem. And thank you, Shivani and Dr. Raja, for your patience with this. I'm not sure why this is happening, but this is a way to remember when you do your own research is to think of reducing quite complicated ideas to diagrams. It's remarkably effective. And then my final point is, what were the ethical considerations specific to this project? Some respondents were students within the institution in which the lead researcher was a lecturer. Student volunteers did not join the project until the researcher no longer had any assessment or teaching duties in relation to them, because it wouldn't be any good if I was still giving them marks and they wouldn't be speaking freely there. Staff respondents might resent extra workload, so the lead researcher took on all administrative duties for the project, allowing colleagues to work with the key concepts undisturbed. Publication risked exposure of current students and staff who might have spoken critically of the institution. So strict anonymity was adhered to, individuals were coded in the analysis, any details that would facilitate detection of identities was altered, omitted, or coded. And religious aspects, this is a big one with working with, I've studied in the West all my life and have taught here. So there is a kind of inbuilt, and we find this in the academic systems, basically a kind of inbuilt uncomfortableness with religious ideas. The religious aspects of West African and Hindu ideas being explored could have been considered inappropriate in a secular institution, and in many ways they are. But the concepts were clearly contextualized. It was explained that these thought systems incorporate religion, philosophy, mythology frequently, but also have strong critical and analytical traditions. The comparative reflections with contemporary and education theory created a bridge between these different spheres. So all of that was the ongoing process. And part of it was, from a post-colonial context, it was very important to establish that if you simply say you can't talk about these ideas because it might be trying to influence, it might be seen as influencing the students to be religious, you would shut out huge swathes of subject matter. So everything is very complex. Everything needs to be contextualized and explained and thought through. And my final diagram This one is meant to overlap, and it's just as it should be. When thinking about the life cycle of the research and the research project, you have all these elements, but running through them all is this notion of ethics and true dialogue. So I hope you found that useful. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this elaborated descriptions about ethical issues related to morality, culture, and ethics, and especially the respondents, their importance. Shall we start a discussion round? Because one question has been asked by Thakur Krishna Shankar Rao. Which type of questions? Am I audible to you, ma'am?
Yes.
The question is, which type of questions are good for analysis, and open-ended or close-ended questions? From the respondent side, like the question, which type of questions are good, open-ended questions or close-ended questions with respect to better analysis of the data?
It depends on the research question. So it really does depend on the question. What is the type of information that you want to? Would you like to give me an example of something that you're doing? And I'll see if I can say something about it.
If Thakur Krishna's, if you're here, please unmute yourself and you can ask your question directly. Thakur Krishna Shankar, if you're here, please unmute yourself and you can ask directly this question. In a
Okay.
journal view, if I say, ma'am, it's okay, you continue.
No, I'm saying it depends on on what you're trying to find out, and either way, for the analysis, yeah, if you want to keep life simple, then you would ask simple yes/no questions, and you would just try and get you correlate your answers, etc. But you might be missing something. So if you're asking more open-ended questions, then when you come to analyzing it, that's the process that I described. One way of analyzing it would be to see what are the different categories into which these answers are falling. And really, I can't really say more than that unless you give me an example of what specific thing you're talking about. But my whole point in this whole entire talk is that there are no absolute hard and fast rules for any of these things. Your role is to find the right process for your research project within the bounds of the discipline that you're studying and the ethos of the institution that you're working with and the community that you're working with. Will that do?
Okay, ma'am. Yeah, it's a very good response from the question. Can I ask you one question, ma'am? The researchers, what are the researchers' responsibility to take the confidentiality of the respondents' responses also while working on their data, while collecting this such kind of data? How important is the confidentiality of respondents in terms of culture and the other aspects?
Yeah, it's very much like the question about anonymity. So the confidentiality is maintained in many different ways. One is, of course, that you would anonymize when you write the data. So when you write up the data. The other is that you don't go around the marketplace telling everybody what you just spoke about to everybody else. That may sound flippant, but on a more serious level, you will be very careful about how you store your data, where you discuss the project. So you can discuss in broad terms, but what you will not be saying, oh yes, the head priest from that temple said this to me, or that lady who lives in such and such street said this to me. That is confidentiality. And it's all about the way it is set up. And that is what you're promising to your respondents. When you get their written permission, you will be saying on it, this is exactly how I will be storing the data. This is where it will be used. This is where it will be, I'm hoping to disseminate the findings of this project. So it's a very important area to be aware of at every stage of the game.
are the participants knowing their rights of reserving their information, how much they have to share like this? It's a very important aspect, I guess.
They should do. Yeah, I mean that is the understanding now in ethical guidance, that most of what is saying now, it is absolutely written that you first of all you get written permission, you revisit that permission, and you do make it very clear to them, because we can be in the habit of thinking, well, I'm the researcher, the world is there for me to research and make an inquiry about. But actually, people are busy with their lives. Why should they give you this information? Should they stop their work? And they want to know where the ideas are going. I think there might be situations where you might say, well, it's going to be more of a burden to them, or it's going to be, but in principle, it's their information, it's their views, it's their images. And unlike the old days when you would just go about taking pictures of this, that, and the other group and talk about them as though they didn't have a brain of their own, it's much more of a collaborative process. So yes, this is the way in the arts and humanities training that I've been trained in myself, and have the training I've delivered, this is something that's paramount. It is something that artists also encounter as a problem, because artists were used to thinking, well, okay, now I'm expected to do research and show it, but they would just go about making work using images of other people, or having a light conversation with someone and then putting that into their text-based work, which is very exposing.
I think
So it's taken a lot of training for them to realize you need permission.
Yes, Bilkul, ma'am. And I think it's a responsibility of the researchers also to make aware of respondent also about the negative and positives of sharing the information and the consent related issues also. Like there should be a mutual understanding while sharing and utilizing this data in further research processes, because it's a very important and sensitive issue related to ethics and morality.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that, and that's all about the partnership with your respondents. But you're quite right. I think you can also you might be saving them from other unethical researchers by saying, by the way, do you know you have a right to say this? Do you know you have a right to withdraw this? The minute you start informing them, they will be better equipped to deal with the next person.
So any university of yours have drafted such kind of any guidelines related to ethical and morality issues? Like universities have related to these publications and all. Is there any guidelines available?
There are
Like
many on the internet. If you look at the research exercise framework, which is a national across Europe body, that assesses the research that is going on and places expectations on lecturers to be research active. They have set up various training things, but I think the universities in India are beginning to write up their own guidance. That there's that one that was in the slideshow, which you shared with me, Shivani, the paper from Aligarh Muslim University. They have written a very concise set of guidance. They also come to the conclusion that most universities have not yet done this. So they are saying this is something that everyone should have. The change I've seen in I was attached to the critical studies department and the master's project of an art school. The changes I've seen over my years of teaching is that it's gone from absolutely no awareness to quite clearly written guidance and pro formas that are already available on the virtual learning environment for students and staff that they are expected to look at, checklists that they go through, templates for permission forms that they might use with their fellow students. And in my own research training program, this was when they wrote their research proposal, they had to also provide the ethical guidance checklist, show that they had gone through it, and that they should flag up. They should be thinking themselves, what are the ethical considerations I need to be aware of?
Yeah. Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much. I have to check again if any message is. It's all about your presentation. Excellent presentation, madam. Some messages has been they're posting. Arangza Momin, she want to ask something, I guess. Arangza, you can unmute yourself and you can ask directly question to ma'am. Arangza Momin, you can ask question directly if you want to ask. You can unmute yourself, Arangza, or you can type the question. No problem. Arangza Momin, am I audible to you? You can type your question. You have raised your hand. That's why I'm asking you. All right. So, ma'am, I would like to conclude this session with the note that being one of the most diverse country in the world, researchers in India have to work with a variety of cultural, political, economical, and religious setting. And I think this presentation would definitely help our research students, not only in the research as well as in the teaching as well, about the very various and basic, I would say fundamental concepts of morality, ethics, and culture, and our role while collecting the data from the respondents, especially in the cultural values. And I would like to say thank you so much, ma'am, for sparing your in this session a time with us and sharing your vast knowledge with my students. And I'm equally thankful for you that just in my simple invitation you accepted this, and you're sharing your entire knowledge and large number of publication also you have quoted, including my own as well publication you have quoted. I'm very thankful such an updated information you have discussed with the students. Thank you so much, ma'am. From the entire team of organizing committee of College of Horticulture, I would like to express my sincere thanks, gratitude to you, ma'am, for this presenting this wonderful presentation on morality, ethics, and culture, and our respondent in research practices. Thanks again, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all of you for listening, and Dr. Svani, Dr. Raja, for all the support and help, and just for inviting me in the first place. It's been a real pleasure to be in India for a little while and wherever else everyone else is. So all of you have a very good evening. Stay well, and who
Ma'am,
knows,
just
maybe our
be
paths will cross for real one day.
Ma'am, be here. We want to have a photo with all the participants. So I would like to request all the participants to open their videos, and we'll have a group photo. Can you stop the slide share, ma'am? Ranjana,
Oh,
ma'am,
yes.
you can stop your slides so that we can have a
Speaker. Enable speaker.
Okay now?
yes. Yeah, just let me have this one,
Yes.
gallery view.
Gallery.
So we can have a photo of all the participants for our record. You can also have a look of on our participants.
Yeah, it's nice to see real faces. I'm going to take a picture as well.
Okay, ma'am. We're also recording for you as well. We'll share you the recording. Entire recording will be in the YouTube also. So
Okay.
just be here for another 5 minutes, all the participants. Open your cameras because we are having only your name. Open your camera, all the participants. Arangsa, if you want to ask question right now, you can have. You have a chance. You can ask question. I know you are my student. Why you are feeling shy? Huh? Being a student of this college, you're feeling shy, asking questions. You're just raising your hand only. What happened? You have a chance to go for direct interaction. Why don't you ask question? You raise your hand. If you have any doubt, you can ask question, or any other participant. So I would like to say thanks again to ma'am. This is the last session which is ended quite well with such an ease, and I'm very thankful to all the participants. They have attended from the beginning since 22 September till 25 of September, and I'm very thankful for their support, and on time they used to join this webinar. And I would like to announce one very important announcement, that after this we'll have a feedback session where I send you the link for the feedback of our today's resource person. And after that we'll have a quiz after half an hour of that feedback session. So by the time, be in touch and be online with me for some formalities of this webinar. So thank you so much, all of you. Ma'am, thank you once again. I'll be in touch with you. So thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am.